Hey, music community, Jeff here again, and it is time. I know it has been since March since I did one of these. I was doing the top 10 from certain years, and I have, a lot of things going on, so I somehow got behind. I've had the numbers and stuff on my desk for a while, a couple weeks, but we're up to 1991. Just a reminder of how we play this game, if it's my little game, is 10 great albums from my vinyl collection from the year 1991. So again, we're limiting myself to my vinyl collection. I'm not pulling out CDs. These are just albums that I think are great from 1991 that I currently own on vinyl. So I did notice this year there weren't quite as many on my list. So some years in the 80s it was a lot. So of course in the 90s and 91 we're starting to see a lot of grunge and alternative stuff coming out. I really don't have any of that. It wouldn't be on my top 10. We're also starting to see a lot of little more extreme music coming out. I was looking at some of the bands that came out that year, and it just seemed like things were getting even much, a bit more aggressive. And I wasn't going really that route terribly much, so there weren't a lot of those. But the ones I did have on my collection, on my list of 1991 releases, I'm like, I pretty much own most of these on vinyl. So they were all eligible, which some years it's like, oh, I wish I could include this, but I don't have it on vinyl, and so I'm limiting myself. Anyway, so yeah, I still had a good amount to choose from, and I'm probably going to have a bunch of bands in here that maybe a lot of you are not as familiar with, because 91, it was a diverse year, split up between different types of stuff. But let's get right into this. The number 10, LivingSacrifice. This is me getting into the heavier stuff. This is aggressive, not death metal, not extreme, but in 1990 they released a 3-song cassette, Not Yielding to Ungodly, and I think the bass player sent that to me back then. I was still tinkering with the magazine stuff, and I was blown away by it. It's aggressive. I didn't compare it to any other band because I wasn't listening to a lot of other bands in this genre, but people kept saying LivingSacrifice sounded a lot like Slayer. It was only years later that I ever really got into. I was into Slayer a little during the Hell Awaits and prior, and they don't really sound like that. But when you start getting into the other later years, into the later 80s and earlier 90s, I agree, they sound a lot like that. So I found that out later in life when I started revisiting some of the Slayer stuff. But this is their first full-length album. Great stuff. This was actually recently reissued on vinyl, like within the past 2 years or so, for the first time. And so this is in there at number 10, one of my favorite more extreme metal albums of the 90s. Number 9, ChagallGuevara, another one that just came out on vinyl a couple months ago actually, and I'm glad to have that and represent it on the list. In 91 when this came out. So 91 was a transition period in my life. There was a lot going on. Let's see. So there are a lot of memories, and I was finding that as I'm remembering some of these albums, I'm like, oh, okay, I was here at that place, but on this album I was here at that place. Because 1991, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and we were building a house, our first house. We were moving out of base housing. My wife was getting out of the military in 91. We were moving out of base housing, and we had contracted to build our own little house out in the country on some property on like 3/4 of a 2 3/4 of an acre. And so there was that transition. And so this album I remember listening to while I was in base housing, whereas some of the other ones on this list, I'm like, we were living in the house at that point. So our son was later born in September of that year. And so there's that little transition between starting a family and buying our first house. So this was earlier, and I listened to this in base housing. Great stuff. This is, as mentioned before, this is kind of a super group. A lot of the musicians here come from other bands. They are from the contemporary Christian side of things, but this album was their writing for a non-Christian audience, and so it was more mainstream release. They had a song on the Twister soundtrack, I think, whatever. They did some other stuff. They were breaking out of that CCM mold. Love this album still to this day. I'm glad they just put that on vinyl just like a couple months ago. All right, for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, VanHalen. I admit, in the Sammy Hagar years, I love Sammy Hagar, love the solo stuff, all the way up to VanHalen. But when he joined VanHalen, and VanHalen kind of, to me, went real commercial, kind of lost interest. So I didn't spend as much time listening to this stuff during this year during the years that these were coming out. It was only years later that I really got back into paying more attention to it and listening to it. So, but this has become, one of my favorites. It's a great one in here. So, of course, this is one of the unofficial releases, because now I'm hoping we'll see the official release now that they're hitting the Van Hagar years with the vinyl reissues. But it's a great album, had some great videos, had some great tunes, and so had to put that in there. And here we go with Bride's Kinetic Faith. So I admit, when this came out, I was like, I thought it was kind of weird. I mean, the album before this was kind of different, but this one was even more different. And at first, I was kind of like, I don't know. It was just kind of weird. Ski masks and handguns. It just had some weird topics, had some weird music, but admittedly, it has grown immensely over the years on my favoritism. So it is recently reissued also on vinyl, and so it has become. It's got a lot of classics, a lot of things. Just listen. And I remember this one came out when I was living in the house, or at least listened to it a lot when I was living in the house. I just have all those fond memories of this playing quite often while we were in the new location. So yeah, great stuff. Been a big fan since the beginning. SacredWarrior Obsessions, again, another one. At the time when it came out, it's a really great album. If you're not familiar with SacredWarrior, very Queensryche-ish. He's got the high soaring vocals. They've always been kind of compared to that. A little more on the metal side, or consistently the metal side, versus the way that Queensryche has changed and fluctuated in the early years. But loved the band's first album, and then this, all the albums are great. This is the fourth album. By this point, there were so many other bands that were distracting me. But from this point, it started kind of sound a lot like what we had before. It wasn't like they were breaking new ground. But ever since this has been reissued on vinyl not too long ago, and ever since this has been returning to play in my mind, I'm realizing that there's a lot of greatness here that maybe got pushed to the side only because of just overwhelmed with so much music, and just kind of feeling that way about it sounding a lot like the same. But anyway, love this album. It had to be on my list. So there you go. Check out SacredWarrior Obsessions. All right, gotta have a little Ozzy on there, right? Had a lot of bigger hits that are still around today. Not a lot of them, but No More Tears is a big one. And this, to me, is one of the real solid Ozzy albums from the time frame. Kind of hit or miss after this on a lot of different things, but this is one of the last. Well, I don't want to say it's one of the last great ones. It's just one of the ones that has so many memories tied to it. I remember hearing these on the radio songs and seeing the videos back in the day, and and I remember this one being. I think I was more on bass at the time, so we must have still been around bass housing when I remember hearing a lot about this on the radio and stuff at the time. But yeah, so there you go. No More Tears, little Ozzy there. All right, it's the album that you either love it or hate it. It's like the Turning Point, Metallica Black Album. Yes, they left the harder thrash edge of the first few albums, but probably one of their biggest selling albums. I mean, do they regret it? Did they get rid of? Did they, upset their fans? Yes, but I mean, start to finish, almost nothing but hits here. It was obviously a good choice for them as far as their careers go, and it just was, an amazing breakthrough album for them, and it brought them into a lot of other households. So yeah, I mean, I like it. It's a solid album from start to finish. I really like it. I love the first three albums the most, as a lot of people do, but it's kind of like different eras. A lot of bands change. I think this was a good album, great album from start to finish. So putting that in there. All right, SkidRow, Slave to the Grind. I remember this one. I remember seeing. I didn't listen to a lot of SkidRow when these first came out, but I remember seeing the video for Monkey Business and thought, that is just the cowbell, the song, just the groove of that song. Everything about it just blew me away when I saw that video, and I'm like, wow. I mean, these guys are really breaking down breaking down some walls with their music. It was some great stuff, from the vocals to just the groove of the song. And this album, really, I was like, I there's a lot of great stuff on this album. And so, first album had a lot of good hits, but I think they really took it up a notch with the second one, with Slave to the Grind. And yeah, it's still a favorite of mine of the whole Skid Row collection. Number 2, Tourniquet Psycho Surgery. Definitely, this is so. Tourniquet, as I probably mentioned lots of times in the past, Tourniquet had one singer for the first 3 albums, and then they changed singers. So it's 2 different eras of a band. First 3 albums were very much more musically, I think they were different. Even there were some member changes aside from the singer. There were some changes that took place on like the 5th, 4th, 5th albums. They started changing a little more, but the difference between the first 3 and then the new singer, it's a, it's a different feel. And so I still kind of favor the first 3 albums, this being number 2. And so this album is absolutely up there with me. So the other day, a friend of mine he tinkers with editing music and stuff, there's a song on here where they've got they work with the rap guy, and so it's like rap metal. And this particular friend was like, I can't stand that rap part, and so he went in and edited it out. Beautifully flawless edit. It sounds like there's nothing missing. But aside from the fact that there's a lot more instrumentation before there's ever any singing, because the song starts off with rapping and then the singer from the band and then back and forth. But other than that, from somebody familiar with the song, I'm like, it feels like something's missing. There's just so much music with very little words. But you couldn't tell where the edits were. It was just great. But I'm like, I really dig the rapping part, so I hated to see that go. But anyway, so there is that on there. A little more experimentation on here, but just lots of thrashy guitar, just lots of intricate time signatures. Ted Kirkpatrick, just amazing drummer. Of course, we recently lost him last year. And so, anyway, Tourniquet's always been up there as just one of my favorites. And so there they are at number 2. And number 1 for 1991, the Galactic Cowboys. Definitely got a lot of play. Didn't know anything about them. I bought them because they were on this. All the talks were on the same label, same management as King's X. I was a big King's X fan. When this came out, I bought it. Absolutely. It stayed in my, at the time, in my CD deck in my car so much. The harmonies, the music, the aggressiveness, the time changes, the funkiness, it's hard to describe. It's just like funky, heavy, lots of harmonies, lots of beautiful melodies, just amazing stuff with a metallic metal aggression. So if you haven't heard Galactic Cowboys, please check them out. They did an album a few years ago. They got back together, but the first few albums by them are just must-have. This being too a must-have. This needs to be reissued. This is an import. I don't even know how. I don't know. Maybe it was released on vinyl in America, but the one I got, it's kind of flimsy. And this they really need to reissue the first couple on vinyl and CD, bring them back into the world. So they are just absolutely treasures. And there you go. That's my number 1. So anyway, what do you think? Well, give me some of your picks below. What do you think about some of the bands that I mentioned? Do you know all the bands that I've mentioned? Leave me some comments, and I'll be back with another later. Rock on and rock hard.